1 Samuel chapter 15 is where we are this morning in our Bible study. And really, this is kind of part of a series of narratives talking about the rejection of Saul as king. In chapter 13 began with Saul being rejected as king when he refused to wait on Samuel and wait on the Lord. It was 7 days and Samuel hadn't shown up, and Saul started to get a little panicky because his army is starting to desert him, so he offers the sacrifice. And right in the middle of that, Samuel shows up and says, what is this you've done? This is foolishness. The Lord will not let your kingdom endure now. Now he has sought out a man after his own heart, and he will give it to him instead. Now, that basic same thing kind of happens in chapter 15, only this time it's a different incident, but it's the same issue, and it's the same event in the sense that Saul winds up getting rejected as king. Saul gets rejected as king actually 3 times in the Bible, just like he gets anointed 3 times in the Bible. He's anointed by he's chosen as king 3 times in the Bible. In chapter 9, twice. In the beginning of chapter 10, Samuel anoints him. At the end of chapter 10, he's chosen publicly by the people. And in chapter 12, he's kind of reaffirmed as king once again. Well, in chapter 13, he's rejected as king. In chapter 15, he's rejected as king. In chapter 28, Samuel says, you're going to die. Your kingdom's not going to endure because you disobeyed the Lord. Samuel actually comes back from the dead to reject Saul as king one more time, just for that purpose. But chapter 15, we have a battle not with the Philistines, but with the Amalekites. Can I get someone to read the first 9 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 15?
Samuel also said to Saul, the Lord sent me to appoint you king of his people of Israel. Now therefore keep your voice before the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up to me. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant, nursing child, oxen, and donkey. So Saul gathered his people together and numbered them. Eliam, 200,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 men of Judah. Saul came to the city of Amalek, and wait in the valley. Saul said to the Kenites, go, depart, get down from among the Amalekites, where you showed kindness for all the children of Israel. The Kenites departed from the Amalekites. Saul attacked the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur. He also took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people. But Saul and the people spared Agag, the best of the oxen, fat, lamb, and all that was good, and were unwilling to everything despised and worthless.
All right. First of all, I think we need to ask ourselves this question. Why does God want to destroy Amalek so badly? What's the reason for that?
Well, at the time coming up from the wilderness to the promised land of Canaan, Amalek, further.
No, that was Edom.
That was Edom, I'm sorry.
And Edom did that in Numbers chapter 20. And then you have a similar incident recorded with Sihon, king of the Amorites, in Deuteronomy chapter 2.
Amalek acted.
Yes. Yes. There's a couple of passages that are relevant to that. Exodus chapter 17. In Exodus chapter 17, you have the incident of the water from the rock at Meribah and Massah. And then in verse 8, it says, just out of the blue, Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose men for us and go out, fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up on the top of the hill. So it came about when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. And when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other. Thus his hands were steady until the sun set. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Well, that makes it kind of sound like Amalek already lost, doesn't it? It's like, well, why this? But then you have this statement in verses 14, 15, and 16. The Lord said to Moses, "Write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." Moses built an altar and named it, "The Lord is my banner." And he said, "The Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation." Now, why would God want to utterly blot out their memory if they've already won the battle here? I mean, they're not really Canaanites. Vengeance is His, okay. So why exercise vengeance here? He can. Did He ever explain why? Huh? Yes, very good.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
No. No, that was not the answer this time. No, okay, there's another passage in Deuteronomy 25 that sheds some additional information on what happened here. In verses 17 through 19, it says, "Remember what Amalek did to you along the way when you came out from Egypt, how he met you along the way and attacked you among you, all the stragglers at your rear, when you were faint and weary, and he did not fear God. Therefore it should come about when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your surrounding enemies in the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." You must not forget. That's Deuteronomy 25 in verses 17 and through 19. And so basically, Amalek didn't come out and say, "All right, let's have your army fight our army." They didn't line up for battle the way that nations normally do when they go to war. Amalek attacked the stragglers. Amalek attacked the weaklings. They attacked the people who were vulnerable. It's kind of like, let's get the women and children who can't fight back. Well, the problem with that, of course, is that's not the way the warfare is to be conducted. And it says very particularly in verse 18 that he did not fear God. So once Israel gets their land, they must blot out the memory of Amalek. Their punishment is utter destruction. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, when we come back there, God tells Saul to go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has. The verb in Hebrew for utterly destroy, sometimes placing something under the ban or devoting something to destruction. The idea, it's the same term that's used of the Canaanite warfare. Whenever Joshua, in Joshua chapter 6, was talking about Jericho, he said that everything in that city will be under the ban. It's that same term that's being used for utter destruction. He says you can't have any of it. It's going to be utterly destroyed. No spoil for anybody. And of course, when Achan violates that ban, he himself is devoted to destruction. He himself is placed under the ban in Joshua chapter 7. The Canaanites are supposed to be utterly destroyed. The ban was the punishment for idolatry in the law as well, I think in Exodus chapter 22 and verse 20. So we see that kind of thing is going on. The Amalek must be placed under the ban the way the Canaanite cities were placed under the ban. By the way, anybody know who the Amalek was actually descended from? Just kind of curious. Was he a Canaanite? They're right. They were descendants of Abraham. Amalek was actually the son of one of Edom's descendants, or Esau's descendants, in Genesis chapter 36. Genesis 36 makes reference to how Esau's son Eliphaz had a concubine named Timnah, and she bore Amalek to Eliphaz. Now, the Amalekites, they were descended from Edom, but they weren't really part of Edom because they were the son of a concubine. So they weren't really, they're connected to them, but they're not really part of the nation at the same time. And so they're kind of separate and apart there. But God explicitly spells out what He wants done here. He says, go destroy all that he has. Do not spare him. Put to death man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. That's pretty total and brutal. This is, in fact, one of the few places in Scripture where God explicitly orders the killing of children. And that, kind of makes us feel a little squeamish when we read that. Another thing that we might point out is that several centuries have passed since the first war with Amalek. So God does occasionally punish people in totality for the sins of their dead ancestors. We see that here. But Amalek was originally a descendant of Edom. He allied... Let me ask you something. Was that the only time that Amalek ever fought Israel? They just kind of minded their own business the rest of their history? God's just punishing people 200 years after the fact to fulfill some grudge against their ancestors. Is that what's going on here? Nobody's going to try to answer that? What? Huh? Balaam is mentioned. Well, Amalek is mentioned in the story about Balaam. Balaam pronounces a curse on Amalek in one of his oracles. We might also look at Judges. In the time of the Judges, Amalek allied with, when Eglon the Moabite oppressed Israel in Judges 3, who was allied with him? The Amalekites. When the Midianites started attacking Israel and stealing their food, who was allied with Midian? Amalek. In Judges 3 and in Judges 6, you can read reference to that. The Amalekites were constantly getting involved in the oppressors of Israel during the time of the Judges. And now, you don't really see much about them being defeated, except maybe in a couple places here and there. What you do see now is that God finally decides, okay, this is going to stop. And the destruction of the Amalekite families, well, why destroy their whole family as opposed to just the men? Keep it from ever happening again, you know? There's kind of a talionic retribution here. There's kind of a just desserts thing going on here too. The Amalekites attacked the weaklings, the stragglers, the women, the children. Now the same thing's going to happen to them. Or as Saul later says to Agag in this chapter, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. Which indicates that even Agag himself was not a very nice person. He went around making women childless. So all those that's kind of elaborate long answer to the first question, why does God want to destroy Amalek so totally? But I think it's important to contemplate this and think about why God does what He does here, because He has told us this information for a reason. In the war against Amalek itself, Saul rallies his army. Saul has a much bigger army than he did in chapter 13. In chapter 13, he only had 3,000 to start with, and then they deserted until he was down to 600. Here, Saul starts with 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. Once again, we see that Judah is being numbered separately from the rest of Israel. And in verses 4 through 6, Saul has this little interaction with the Kenites. Who are the Kenites? Anybody know who the Kenites were? In verses 4 through 6? Saul seems awful eager to spare these people. Yes, he did. And Moses' father-in-law is Jethro or Hobab the Kenite. What did he do? What did the Kenites do for Israel? Were they good people? Were they bad people? Okay, so the Amalekites, it's kind of the opposite of Amalek then. The Amalekites, they ambushed Israel and they oppressed them when they came out of the wilderness. But the Kenites showed kindness to them and were favorable towards them. Hobab the Kenite in Numbers 10:29 was actually a guide to them in the wilderness. And so we kind of see an example of how God's generational justice works both ways. The way Amalek, Amalek's bad behavior in the past means the destruction of their present people. The Kenites' good behavior in the past means that they will be spared in the present. Sometimes people they'll get all hung up about, well, why is God punishing these people over here, for the crimes of their ancestors? Well, why is God sparing these people over here for the goodness of their ancestors? It works both ways. It's funny how you never see anybody object to the second thing. There's an inconsistency there. Yes, Mark.
Well, in Numbers, it says, Judges, 12 children in the wilderness. And further, specifically, jailed by the keeper.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. The Kenites were also, or more specifically, a Kenite woman was instrumental in the death of Sisera in Judges chapter 4. Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. There's another... the Kenites by the way, the Kenites were actually Canaanites. They're listed in Genesis 15 as one of the groups of people that God is taking the land away from to give to Abraham's descendants in Genesis 15:19. But they were one of the people marked for destruction originally. But they don't appear in subsequent lists. I think that's interesting. God bringing about the Canaanite genocide, was ultimately a conditional promise. Conditional upon their repentance. It's like when Jonah goes through Nineveh and says, Nineveh is going to be destroyed in 40 days. Well, Nineveh wasn't destroyed. Why? Because the Ninevites repented. Because they changed something. And God, in turn, relented of the calamity that He was going to bring on them. The same is true of the Kenites. The Kenites were originally marked for destruction, but later on they're not. Why? Because they showed kindness to Israel in the wilderness. Because Jethro converts to the worship of the true God. We see that there's how many more of the Canaanites could have gotten out of their destruction had they turned to the Lord and repent? Why wait for judgment? Because the Lord is patient towards you, wishing you to come to repentance as well. All right, so that's on the Kenites. Any comments or questions at this point? I'm just kind of blazing through this material a little bit, but all right. In verses 7 through 9, they have the actual war. We don't give the battle in much detail. It's typical of the Bible. We don't get the battles themselves in detail. We get the aftermath. Saul defeats the Amalekites from Havilah as you go to Shur. He captures Agag and kills everybody else. And he spares Agag the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs. Why would Saul have spared Agag? That is a really good question. Why?
Talking about God.
No.
Appears to be a custom. Kings there. He did another king and took over his territory. So they would bring the king in, sit at their table and eat. That was a trophy. Look, I got 40 kings eating at my table here. I'm just such a great king. I wiped out all these guys. Mm-hmm. So he brought him back as a trophy.
There's a similar thing in Judges chapter 1. Adonai-Bezek refers to the fact that he captured all these kings and cut off their thumbs and their big toes and made them gather scraps around his table. It was kind of a way of picking himself up a little bit. There's another example of this kind of thing in 1 Kings chapter 20, actually, that maybe even a little bit more parallel. Whenever Ahab defeats the Arameans and captures Ben-Hadad, Ben-Hadad basically makes a deal with him for his life and says, I'll give you these cities and we'll call it good. And Ahab lets him go. And the Lord rebukes him for that and says, why have you let go the one whom I devoted to destruction? There's that same term is used of Ben-Hadad in 1 Kings chapter 20. And because Ahab does with Ben-Hadad what Saul did with Agag, I'm sure that's a tongue twister somewhere. Because Ahab does that, he gets pretty much the same punishment Saul does. His kingdom, he's killed and his kingdom is taken away from him. It's pretty remarkable how, and here's the other thing, why spare the best animals? Why kill a perfectly good animal? What are they going to do with this?
Well, propagate good animals.
Okay. Yeah.
And then two, sacrifice God.
Well, yeah. The excuse that Saul gives throughout is, we saved these animals for sacrifice. And I can see human rationalization kind of working here. Well, they're going to die anyway if we sacrifice them, right? So we're technically destroying them. So we're technically doing what God says, right? Don. No. This is not a pretty picture, Well, I mean, and you can picture the rationalizations here. We destroyed most of the stuff. We killed most of the people. And we're going to kill these animals too. We're just going to sacrifice them to the Lord. Isn't that a much better thing to do? Isn't that more spiritual anyway? Oh yeah. We'll get to him blaming the people in a second. But yeah, I mean, it's all, Now we get down to the confrontation here, because what Saul did was not obedient to the Lord, and we have a rather lengthy reading. I want to try to break it up. Can somebody read verses 10 through 19? All right, well, here we see, first of all, God comes to Samuel. He tells him, I regret making Saul king. Why would God regret that? He's not obeying. A little later on in verse 29, Samuel makes a remark, the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man, he should change his mind. But wait a second, God, didn't you just change your mind back here at the beginning? How do we reconcile that?
The fact that God regretted making Saul king, not mean God didn't know how. I believe God did not. Saul still had.
Right.
God regret. I mean, you haven't been a parent long. But I have. Parents that are grandparents have seen this. Don't do this. The child does it anyway. That's fine. So, sorry. I regret that, but you know what? You got yourself into it. I told you not to do it. I knew how it was going to turn out. Now, knowing how it's going to turn out does not mean you don't regret the fact that it happened that way.
Yeah, that's true. I mean,
So that's kind of the sense of I think.
yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, you get this idea, a little later on that. Some people, they'll lift a passage like verse 29 out of context. God never changes his mind. He foreordains everything. Well, the problem is, of course, that you've got too many places in the Bible where God does change his mind for that really to fly. You got Moses and Israel's golden calf worship. You got Jonah and the Ninevites. You got Hezekiah and his illness, and on and on and on we go. The point is, the point in verse 29 is no amount of superficial pleading is going to get you your way, Saul. You're not going to be able to bribe the Lord into changing his mind. In this case, the Lord regrets that he made Saul king, much as he regretted even making mankind on the face of the earth in Genesis 6, we might say. Dennis? Oh, really?
Also,
It's actually the same term, you're right. I mean...
and so he's already said.
But then Samuel...
Hey, I'm not going to
Yes. That's an interesting way... that's an interesting way to think about it. I regret making Saul king. I don't want to have regret, so I'm getting rid of you. That's an interesting way to read it. hadn't thought of it, but sometimes simplest solution is best. So, it's I'll think about that. That's good. Okay, yeah. So Saul. Now Saul, what does Saul think about his obedience? I did obey the Lord. He keeps insisting over and over, I obeyed the Lord. How could Saul get something like that so wrong? I mean, Samuel's point, if you've done what God said, why do I hear sheep and oxen? Why is there this thing that's inconsistent with you doing what God said? And Saul's like, well, that was the people's idea. They wanted to offer sacrifices. But we destroyed everything else, and that means we obeyed. That's the argument. You see, there's a very fundamental difference in the attitude here. For Saul, partial obedience is the same thing as obedience. I partially obeyed, so I obeyed. That's for Saul. But for God, and for Samuel here, partial obedience is not obedience at all, not even in the slightest. You did not obey the voice of the Lord because you only partially did what I told you to do. And so therefore you did not obey. That's the difference between God's perspective on obedience and man's perspective on obedience. How do you get it so wrong? Well, Saul sticks to his guns throughout this conversation up to a certain point anyway. You read verses 20 and 21. We probably should have read a little further, but when Saul comes out, he says, I've fulfilled the commandment of the Lord, and he gets into this argument with Samuel. Samuel retorts in verse 16 and says, well, let me tell you what God said to me last night. Samuel actually has a voice from the Lord. This isn't just me talking to you, Saul. This is what God thinks of the matter. And God says, you didn't obey. And so, in verse 16, we're kind of made a little hopeful. He says, let me tell you what the Lord said to me. And Saul says, speak. Oh, maybe Saul will listen to the Lord after all this time, right? That's not what happens. What happens after Samuel gives him the oracle from the Lord in verse 20 and 21, Saul said to Samuel, I did obey the voice of the Lord and went on the mission on which the Lord sent me. And I brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people, they took some of the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the choicest of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Well, what's Samuel got to say to that? Right. Somebody read those two verses there, verses 22 and 23. All right. First of all, Saul blames the people for his disobedience. I said we were going to talk about that. That reminds us of what happened in chapter 13, doesn't it? Just as in chapter 13, Saul disobeyed because we got to offer the sacrifice, and he blames it on the people. They're deserting me. It's the people. It's the same thing in chapter 15. We got to offer the sacrifice, and it's the people's fault. And, he won't even listen to a command from the Lord, so Samuel gives him this oracle in verses 22 and 23. That obeying is better than sacrifice. Does God like sacrifice as much as He likes obedience? Well, that's what we call a rhetorical question. The answer is no. Obeying is better than sacrifice. Now, I got a question. Does this mean that sacrifice and obedience are opposites? No. Why not? Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Matthew 23, Jesus, indicts the Pharisees. You keep the little things, you break the big things. You should have done them both. I mean, what's the problem here? There's a number of Old Testament prophets that speak about God hating or not wanting the sacrifice. But then those same Old Testament prophets will turn around and indict the people for not offering the sacrifice like they should. So it's not like, those two things are unwanted by God.
Go ahead. All right.
Yes.
God, your love of God.
Mm-hmm. Uh-oh.
Jesus was upbraided for violating the Sabbath. Violating the Sabbath. Man wasn't made for Sabbath. Sabbath was obedient. We were not made for obedience. Obedience was made for us. God doesn't care as much about obedience as he does about the man. Sacrifice, we were not made for sacrifice. The sacrifice was made for us. God cares more about the man than he does about the sacrifice. All of these things God has commanded us to do were made to make us the kind of people that God wants us to be, men and women after God's own heart. That's the point.
Yes.
Saul forgot that. He thought, oh, we're made to sacrifice. Therefore, I can bring stuff back and sacrifice to God.
It's not as sideways as you think. In Matthew's account of that, Jesus quotes from the Old Testament, "I desire compassion and not sacrifice," from Hosea 6:6, which itself is an allusion to what Samuel said in 1 Samuel 15. So Jesus is quoting a passage that's quoting another passage. That's always kind of fun. God prefers mercy to sacrifice, but this does not mean that sacrifice and obedience are opposites. And for nothing else, because God commanded sacrifice, so therefore, if you're going to obey, sacrifice is part of obedience. But offering ritual sacrifices is not the end in and of itself. One cannot neglect God's commandment simply to expand upon one's voluntary religious obligations. It's like in Mark 7 and Matthew 15 when Jesus condemns the Pharisees because you neglect the commandment to honor father and mother for the sake of giving money to the temple, Korban. You can't do that. That's not appropriate. You can't set aside the Word of God for the sake of tradition. Rebellion, yeah. Yeah. There's another thing in here I think is really interesting. In verse 23, he says, rebellion is the sin of divination. Some versions say witchcraft. They're the same thing. What was Saul's actual attitude towards divination? He went to see the witch of Endor once. Why? But go really look at that passage for a second, okay? The witch of Endor is not too keen on helping him. Why? Right. Okay, yes. And that I think is the key to this whole thing. In 1 Samuel 28 and verse 3, it says that Saul had removed from the land those who were mediums and spiritists. In verse 9, the woman says to him, what Saul's done? He's cut off those who are mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? Under the law of Moses, witchcraft was a capital crime. And Saul enforced that. He went around, he killed these people, and he made sure we got rid of the mediums, got rid of the witches, got rid of the people that do this stuff. That's what Saul's attitude was. For Saul, divination is the worst of sins. And yet Samuel warns him here that his disobedience puts him on a path that is shared by the witches and the wizards, that is shared by the necromancers. So there's a certain irony in the fact that Saul, when the Lord finally won't answer anymore, Saul goes to the witch of Endor to bring up Samuel from the dead, and there is Sam. I mean, it's always kind of interesting to me that 1 Samuel 28, when Samuel appears, they highlight the fact that he's wearing a robe. We'll see why that's important in a minute. But Samuel warned Saul, rebellion is as the sin of divination. By the end of the story, Saul's actually practicing divination. In 1 Chronicles 10, Chronicles lists the consultation of the medium as the explicit reason that the Lord put Saul to death. 1 Chronicles 10 in verses 13 and 14. All right, well, Samuel says this to Saul. What's Saul's reaction? I've sinned. Somebody read verses 24 through 31.
And Saul said,
Oh, no, down to verse 31.
Please.
Well, okay, so one thing I want to point out here is that, when we get to 2 Samuel, and David is confronted by a prophet, Nathan the prophet, and David is confronted with his sin, David says pretty much the exact same thing. I have sinned. Maybe he words a couple things differently, but it's the same thing that Saul says here. I have sinned. Saul says it twice in verses 24 and in verse 30. What makes them different, though? Their hearts. It's interesting to me that David is confronted by Nathan because he kills someone, and Saul is confronted by Samuel because he didn't kill someone that he was supposed to. But Nathan confronts David with a parable. He confronts him with his sin. David, what is missing from David's account that's in Saul's account? What is missing from David's conversation with Nathan that's all over Saul's conversation with Samuel? He makes excuses, right? It's all over the place. David makes no attempt to justify himself. He makes no attempt to pull rank. Nathan doesn't have to pull rank. Nathan doesn't have to pronounce judgment on David's house. But by contrast, when Samuel confronts Saul, Saul argues with Samuel, justifies his actions, makes excuses, blames the people, even in the face of God's direct oracle. It is only after Samuel informs Saul that he will have the kingdom taken away that Saul suddenly goes, I'm sorry. I've sinned. Yes.
Take it. Ask God before he tells us.
Yeah, that's true. He did. He owns up to what he's done, and
Take it.
that's true. That's true. And why does Saul want Samuel to worship with him?
Well, it's God is still with him. Yes, Samuel's part of it.
Yeah.
It's kind of odd to me. Having Samuel by his side as Saul goes up to worship, showing that God is still with Saul.
Yeah. It's really an attempt to save face, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, we got to make sure that this looks right to everybody else who's, religious around us, even though it's not right. He wants Samuel to honor him before all the elders of Israel, even though Saul has not really honored God in the first place. And Samuel actually concedes Saul's request this time. But saving face does not save Saul's soul, and it does not save his kingdom. Just to make an application to us. How many Christians are that way, We come to church, we wear a mask. We pretend like everything's okay. And we try to hide the egregious sins in our lives. We try to hide from people that there's some real crisis in place in a futile effort to save face. Coming into an assembly like this to pretend that everything's okay, that's like putting a Band-Aid on a tumor. It doesn't work that way. And you know what? The elders' opinions of Saul do not matter. Your fellow Christian's opinion of you really does not matter. The only person whose opinion about you matters is God, and whether or not you are right before Him. And that's something I think we all need to learn here. Is if God's opinion with you is right, what man thinks of you does not matter. And if God's opinion with you is wrong, you best fix that. You're not gonna make it better by getting everybody else to like you. Okay, very quickly, since we're out of time now, Samuel said, "Bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites." Agag came to him cheerfully. And Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." Samuel hewed Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah, but Saul went up to his house at Gibeah of Saul. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, for Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. They go to their hometowns after Samuel kills Agag. Agag seems oddly cheerful for a man whose entire town and family have just been destroyed, by the way. Cautiously, really. I don't know. I'll check that. We'll double check the Hebrew on that one. But in the meantime, what we see, Samuel informs Agag, just as his sword made women childless, his mother shall be made childless now. Samuel and Saul depart. They never see each other again, except for the part in the story in chapter 19 where Saul strips naked and lies down in front of Samuel prophesying all night. But this is not the last we see of the Amalekites. David constantly has to fight them throughout his reign. And the end result of that, of course, it isn't until the days of Hezekiah that the Amalekites are actually finally destroyed in 1 Chronicles 4. There's another interesting little thing, though, and I'll just leave you with this, that the conflict kind of extends into the book of Esther. There's two major characters. There's Mordecai, the son of Kish, and there's Haman the Agagite. I'm not sure Haman's literally a descendant of Agag, but the use of language definitely is meant to call to mind this chapter of 1 Samuel and kind of create a spiritual recreation of the conflict between Saul and Agag, one that ends much differently in the book of Esther. I'll just throw that out there. Any comments or questions before we close? We're past time. Next week we'll look at chapter 16.